Hi, this is S.G. Brownlow with Adept Psychology. In our last video, I talked about the two fundamental questions that people have to answer. Who am I? And what is the world about? And in doing that, I brought up the Myers-Briggs type inventory and talked a little bit about what the first and last letter of that mean. In this video, I'd like to talk about the two middle letters and do that in a way that may be a little bit different than what you're used to hearing, and hopefully different than the way you've thought about them before. And those two letters are about the four ways that Jung said that we translate raw experience into something that we can relate to. So the first one I want to talk about is sensation. And sensation is really easy to talk about. It's something that we all have sensations, internal sensations, external sensations. And we all, as therapists, I think, and maybe even as friends, know people that seem to be identified, and that may not be quite the right word, but I can't think of a better one, but they seem to be identified with their sensations. And so, for instance, we all, in the vernacular, we talk about people who are identified with their sex organs, for instance. And so they may have great values and great plans and great everything else, but they see someone, they get aroused, and immediately all of that gets thrown aside. And they do something that we think, gosh, nobody with good sense would do that. But it's because they're very much identified with their sensation, and in this case, their internal sensation of arousal. A second one that's also pretty easy to talk about because we know it, we think about it, is thinking. We talk about thinking. We kind of understand what thinking is. It's planning and creativity and executive functioning and theorizing. And so we all know people who seem to be very stuck in their heads. I worked with a therapist one time who called people like this brains on roller skates. He said they would just they would float around through life, and it's like they didn't have bodies, they didn't have hearts, they didn't have anything, they just had their brain, and they were totally identified with their brain and with their ideas. And everybody else and everything else was just kind of shut out. The third category I'd like to talk about is what Jung called intuition, although I'd like to broaden that a little bit. As it turns out, a lot of our processing does not take place in our brains. It actually takes place in what James called our viscera, our guts, our hearts. Different kinds of processing takes place in our guts and in our hearts. And so where Jung talked about intuition, I like to talk about the gut a little bit, because the gut processes intuition, but that's only one of four things that the gut does. So yes, there's intuition, that's the first one. The second one is aversion. And we kind of know that. It processes fear, it processes disgust. It helps us avoid things that would hurt us. The third thing may be a little bit surprising, but the gut really seems to have a lot to do with how we perceive ourselves in what we call an ego sense. And so it's sort of our small self, how we see ourselves. And it does that by maintaining and advancing stories that we have about ourselves, and comparing our behavior to these stories that we've generated about ourselves. And so it's very much in favor of our being very consistent with our stories, because that's what keeps us safe. And so anytime we vary too much from one of our previous stories, or the situation varies from what our stories have been in the past about what we do and what we are capable of, then the signal it gives us is anxiety. And then the fourth thing that the gut does, which is extremely important, is it provides movement. It keeps us moving forward. And so one way that I think about the gut is that the gut is like the sergeant in the army. Okay, so you have the commander-in-chief who is setting policy. You have the generals in the Pentagon who are making plans for how things are supposed to be happening. But then you have the sergeant who's out in the field, who is actually the one who has to move from here to there, who has to take and secure the objective, who actually does the fighting, who moves forward when the bullets are flying. Now, you don't want the sergeant setting war policy, and you don't want the sergeant making overall plans. The sergeant has two things he wants to do. He either wants to go home and get away from all the flying bullets, or he wants to go. He wants to just kill everything in his path and keep moving forward. And so you can't get your objectives met without the sergeant. You just don't want the sergeant being in charge. So when I hear people say things like, oh, I want to kill my ego, or it's about killing your ego, if you do that, the work will never get done. The ego is inherently tied in with getting work done, and so you don't want to kill the ego, you just want the ego to be your friend. You don't want it telling stories, you don't want it setting policy and telling you that you can't do something because of the stories that it's already set, or what's comfortable or what's fearful. You want to know that it's scary, and you want to still be able to do it. You want to move forward, move the army forward, even when the bullets are flying. Maybe especially when the bullets are flying. That's when you need your ego. Now, the fourth letter corresponds to what Jung called feeling. And here again, I want to broaden that, and I want to talk about heart. The heart is basically responsible, or appears to be responsible, for two kinds of processing. One is about the kinds of deep feelings that we consider spiritual, usually. Life meaning, life purpose, values, what's important to us, what makes life worth living. The other thing that it's responsible for is relationships. How I relate to other people, how they relate to me. And when we think about all of the heartbreaks that we have, and the stabbing pains and all of that, all of those have to do with ruptures in our relationships. We're sad because someone dies. We're heartbroken because someone leaves. We feel pangs of guilt because we've done something that's ruined a relationship. We feel shame because somehow we've been deemed unworthy to be loved in a relationship, or we believe that's true at any rate. All of those are very much part of how our heart functions, but they're all about one of those two things, either values or relationships. So if you're following me so far, then what I'm going to say is that in those middle four letters, we all identify with one of those four things, one of those four parts of our body, our sex organs, our brains, our guts, or our hearts. And we all use another part of our body to help us answer the second question of what other people are like. Again, either our sex organs, our brains, our guts, or our hearts. In sum, that's really what the code of the MBTI is telling us. In my next video, I'm going to explain how all of this relates to the two types of therapists that I would say compose over 90% of the people that I've met as either counselors or psychologists or therapists of some type through over 30 years in the field.